The storm grew darker as Luke Harper dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the snow. The plains around him were silent, except for the hiss of wind and the dying groan of his horse. He dropped to his knees beside the woman. Her dark hair was stiff with frost, her face pale as moonlight. He pressed his fingers to her neck and felt the faintest flutter of life. "Easy now," he muttered, his voice trembling. He had seen men die in winter, but never like this, a soul so close to being claimed by the cold. He tore open his coat, wrapping her inside it, holding her against his chest. Her body was light, fragile, but cold as stone. Snow gathered in her lashes as he lifted her onto his horse, whispering to the animal through chattering teeth. The wind screamed, biting his face raw. "Hold on, girl," he said to her and to himself. Just hold on." He didn't know who she was, only that leaving her meant watching her die. The trail to his cabin was nearly gone, buried under white dunes that rolled like waves. Each step his horse took sank and stumbled. Luke felt the blood freezing in his fingers, but he kept one arm tight around her, feeling for any sign of warmth. He talked to her as they rode, nonsense mostly words, to fight the silence. "You'll make it, miss. Ain't no snowstorm taking us yet." When her head tilted toward him, he thought he heard a breath. It was enough to keep him moving. By the time the cabin appeared through the haze, his vision was spinning. The small shack stood crooked against the hillside, a thin curl of smoke still rising from the chimney. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and stumbled inside. The room was cold but dry, the faint smell of wood and tobacco lingering. He laid her gently on the bed and knelt beside her. Her skin was like ice, her lips cracked and white. For a moment he thought she was gone. Then her chest rose, barely. He threw logs into the stove, sparks flaring to life. Flames licked the iron grate as he stripped off his gloves and rubbed his hands together. He filled a pot with snow and set it to melt, glancing back at her every few seconds. "Come on, girl," he whispered. "You're not dying here." Steam filled the cabin. He soaked a cloth in the warm water and brushed it over her face, her wrists, her throat. Slowly, color returned to her cheeks, faint but real. He peeled away her frozen coat, careful not to tear the fabric clinging to her skin. Beneath it he saw scars, old burns, deep bruises fading yellow. Whoever she was, she hadn't come from peace. He swallowed hard, forcing his hands to steady. He wrapped her in blankets, then lay beside her, his arms a shield against the cold creeping through the cracks. "Breathe with me," he murmured, his breath fogging in the air. He felt the rhythm of her chest, shallow, uneven, and matched it until it grew stronger. Hours passed like minutes. The firelight danced across the log walls, painting them gold and red. Luke stared at her face, wondering how someone so fierce-looking could seem so fragile now. He thought of the border skirmishes, the rumors of Apache raids, the fear that still ran through the settlements. But none of that mattered here, not in this storm, not between two souls just trying to stay alive. "You're safe now," he whispered, though he didn't know if she could hear him. "Ain't no one gonna hurt you." When morning came, the storm had eased. Pale sunlight spilled through the window, dusting her face with warmth. Luke sat slumped in a chair, half asleep, his hat tilted over his eyes. A soft sound made him stir, the sound of breathing, real and steady. He rose, crossing to her side. Her eyelids fluttered, and for the first time he saw her eyes open, dark and bright like wet earth after rain. She looked at him, not with fear, but confusion, as if she couldn't believe she was still alive. He smiled, tired but relieved. "Welcome back," he said softly. She blinked, trying to speak, but no words came. He fetched water and lifted it to her lips, helping her drink. She flinched at first, then sipped slowly, her gaze never leaving his. "You're safe here," he told her again. "I found you out by the ridge. Been near 2 days." She frowned, pointing weakly toward the door, whispering something in her own tongue. He didn't understand, but he caught one word repeated, "Soldiers." Luke's jaw tightened. He'd heard about the cavalry patrols hunting Apache survivors after another raid went bad. Maybe she'd escaped from one of those camps. Maybe the red stain he'd seen in the snow wasn't all hers. None of it changed what he had to do now. "You ain't going back out there," he said, his voice firm. Not till you can walk. At least. She looked away, eyes filling with tears, and he felt something twist inside his chest. Something he hadn't felt in years. Compassion, fear, maybe both. Days passed, marked only by the fire's crackle and the wind whispering through the cracks. Luke fed her broth, helped her sit up, and spoke gently, though she understood little. Sometimes she would touch her chest, where the bullet wound had been bandaged, and murmur words of thanks in broken English. "You save me," he shook his head. "Just did what anyone would." But he knew that wasn't true. Most men would have left her in the snow. Maybe once he would have too, but not anymore. At night, when she slept, he watched the fire dance across the walls and thought about what the world had become. The wars had left everyone scarred. White men, native tribes, all tangled in hate that never thawed. Yet here, in this tiny cabin, there was peace. Her breathing was the only sound he needed. Sometimes she would wake shivering, whispering names he couldn't understand, and he would take her hand until she calmed. "It's over," he'd tell her. "You're safe." And though he wasn't sure he believed it, she always seemed to. By the end of the week, the color had returned fully to her face. She could sit by the fire and eat on her own, her strength growing. Luke taught her simple words: fire, water, safe. She repeated them with a shy smile that warmed the cabin more than the flames ever could. One morning, while he mended his saddle, she reached out and touched his hand. "Luke," she said carefully, testing the sound of his name. He looked up, startled, and for a moment neither spoke. Outside, the snow began to fall again, gentle this time, almost peaceful. That night, as the storm whispered against the walls once more, Luke lay awake, listening to her soft breathing from the other side of the room. He thought about the road that had brought him here, the fights, the loneliness, the long winters with no voice but his own. And now, a stranger lay sleeping under his roof, someone the world had taught him to fear. Yet she was alive because of him, and he somehow was alive because of her. He turned toward the window, watching the snow drift like ghosts, and whispered, "Maybe this cold finally brought me something warm." The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows across the log walls. Luke sat with Asha in his arms, feeling the faint rhythm of her breath rise and fall against his chest. Her skin, once cold as river stone, now held a trace of warmth. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but inside, time seemed to stop. He whispered again, "Breathe with me." His voice was low, steady, carrying through the darkness like a promise. The snow might bury everything else, but not this, not the fragile sound of life fighting its way back. She stirred in his arms, eyes fluttering open. For a moment, confusion clouded her face, then recognition, faint but there. Her lips parted, trembling. "Asha?" she whispered, the word barely audible, but filled with the weight of everything she'd lost. Luke nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "Asha," he repeated softly, grounding her name in the warm air of the cabin. He didn't ask what happened. The story was already written in the bruises on her wrists and the fear that still lingered in her gaze. Days bled into each other as the storm raged on. Luke spent his mornings chopping wood and checking his traps, his evenings tending the fire and making broth from whatever game he could find. Asha watched him quietly, her dark eyes following his every move. Sometimes she'd hum softly, songs in a language he couldn't understand, yet somehow they filled the cabin with peace. Her voice was soft, like the wind moving through cedar branches. For a man who'd lived years without another soul, it was the kind of silence he didn't want to end. By the fourth night, she was strong enough to sit up beside the fire. Luke handed her a tin cup of tea, the steam curling between them. "Better?" he asked. She nodded, wrapping her hands around the cup. "You saved me," she said, each word slow, careful. He smiled faintly. "Guess the snow did us both a favor." She tilted her head, not quite understanding, and he laughed, a sound rusty from disuse. It felt strange, almost wrong, that laughter could live in a place so cold. Yet here it was, flickering between them like light in a storm. When the storm finally broke, the world outside was glassy and still. Luke opened the cabin door to sunlight spilling across untouched snow. Usher followed him, wrapped in his old wool coat. The air was sharp, clean, full of promise. She lifted her face to the sky, eyes closed, and for a moment she looked weightless, like the snow itself. Luke watched her, feeling something stir inside him that he hadn't known in years. Not just gratitude, not just relief, but a quiet awe that this broken, frozen world could still give back something beautiful. Over the next weeks, they built a rhythm. She mended his worn shirts with thin leather cords, cooked cornmeal and rabbit stew, and hummed while the fire burned. He taught her small English words: river, sky, safe. In return, she taught him her words for the same things, soft syllables that rolled off her tongue like poetry. "Tusa," she said once, touching his hand. "What's that mean?" he asked. She smiled faintly, warm. He nodded, trying the word on his lips. "Tusa," she laughed, not loud, but enough to fill the room with something he hadn't felt in years: belonging. Sometimes, when night fell and the fire dimmed, she would stare into the flames and speak in her own language, low and broken, like prayers for the dead. Luke didn't interrupt. He just sat near, knowing some ghosts could only be quieted by being heard. One night, when her voice cracked, he reached out and took her hand. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. The firelight traced their shadows together on the wall. Two wanderers caught between past and present, finding warmth in the wreckage of both. Spring came slowly, melting the snow into rivers that ran through the valley. Luke showed her how to plant beans in the thawed soil, how to fix a saddle, how to call the horses by whistle. Usher watched, learned, and smiled more each day. Sometimes she'd stand at the riverbank, eyes closed, whispering names into the wind. Names of her family, her tribe, the people she lost. Luke never asked her to stop. He only joined her sometimes, not to pray, but to listen. In her words, even if he couldn't understand them, he heard healing. By late April, the valley turned green again. Wildflowers sprouted between the rocks, and the air smelled of pine and rain. Usher's strength returned fully. She could ride, laugh, and even tease him in broken English. "Cowboy slow," she'd say when he stumbled over her language, and he'd grin. "Guess I'm learnin' from the best." But behind every smile was a shadow, the knowledge that one day she'd have to go. Her eyes sometimes wandered toward the ridge where the horizon curved, and Luke felt a familiar ache building in his chest. One evening, as the sun bled red over the valley, she came to him by the fence, holding his old wool coat. "I go," she said softly. He froze, turning slowly. She looked steady, calm, the same strength he saw in her that first night, buried under fear. He wanted to argue, to ask her to stay, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he nodded. "You've got your path," he said quietly. "I can't keep you from it." She stepped closer, placing the coat in his hands. "You saved me," she whispered. "Now I save you from being alone." They stood there for a long time, the wind whispering through the grass. Finally, she reached up and touched his cheek. Just a small gesture, but it carried the weight of every moment they'd shared. Then she turned and began to walk toward the ridge. Luke watched until she disappeared into the trees, her figure swallowed by sunlight and shadow. He stood there long after she was gone, listening to the sound of the wind. The same wind that once howled through the storm, but now carried something gentler: memory. Days passed, then weeks. The cabin felt different without her, quieter, emptier, yet not as lonely as before. Her presence lingered in small things: the blanket folded on the chair, the way she'd arranged the firewood, the faint scent of herbs she used for tea. Sometimes, when the night grew cold again, Luke would sit by the fire and whisper, "Breathe with me," as if she could still hear him. And though he was alone, the warmth never fully left. It lived in him now, a gift from a woman the snow tried to claim. That summer, travelers passing through the valley said they'd seen an Apache woman riding with a small band near the foothills, alive, free, her laughter carrying on the wind. Luke never went looking for her. He didn't need to. She had found her world again, and he had found his peace. The mountains still stood, the rivers still ran, and every sunrise felt like a quiet thank you from the earth itself. In saving her, he had found his own salvation. The cold had tried to take them both, but love, in its quiet, stubborn way, had won.